You're listening to the Jeffrey Willis murder trial from Michigan unfold here on the Law and Crime Network and on Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. We have a new guest joining us now. This is Bobby Chacon. He's a retired FBI agent and current attorney. He's going to help us break this case down. Bobby, good to see you here on Law and Crime.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. Thank you.
Okay, so what do you make of this case? You've looked at cases from the investigatory standpoint and from the legal standpoint. This is a case where jurors are asked to convict a defendant without a lot of direct evidence. It's a tougher case to sell from the prosecution standpoint.
Absolutely. Sure. Corpus delicti, right? So you also don't have a body. So you don't have direct evidence. You don't have, as we normally see in these cases, video from inside the store of the defendant in close proximity to the victim. You don't have even an eyewitness saying that they saw him there. So it's really a tough road for the prosecution. And what you're seeing them do through a series of early witnesses is try to paint a picture of who this guy is. Because normally, sometimes you don't have to try to prove motive as hard as you do if you see the guy there, if you see the defendant in close proximity to the victim, or you actually see the crime happen on video. But here, since you don't have any of that, the prosecution has to paint a motive here. And the motive is coming from the files that are on that computer, the creepy kind of stalking type behavior that they're building through this forensic expert, through the files that he has, the images that he has there, the names of some of the files. So the prosecution is going through this process of painting a picture of who Willis is, and that's going to imply a motive. Obviously a sexual motive. He has, sexual torture and murder. I think there's a rape lover file on there. Mm-hmm. These things are going to go to paint a picture of who Willis is without ever having him on the stand. So, and the prosecution has to do that in these cases where there's really no direct evidence putting him, in proximity to the victim or the potential victim in this case. So that's what you're seeing now. It's a painstaking process. It takes many witnesses to do, but each witness adds a layer to the picture of who this defendant is and why the prosecution thinks he committed this crime.
Exactly. Well, we've got a big question now on our hands. Even if it sounds like Jeffrey Willis is the guy who probably did it, that's not guilt beyond a reasonable doubt as a legal question. So, look, will the facts hit the legal burden of proof that needs to be hit here by the prosecution? That's the big question. But we're going to be back with more testimony from this case in just a second. Bobby, hang on the line. We're going to take a quick break. Again, you're listening to coverage of the Jeffrey Willis murder trial on the Law and Crime Network and on Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. Welcome back, everyone. Aaron Keller here on the Law and Crime Network, and welcome to those of you listening to Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. We're bringing you into the real-life courtroom of Jeffrey Willis, a defendant facing murder charges related to the presumed death, I should say, of gas station attendant Jessica Herringa. She was a young mother. She disappeared at age 25, right in the middle of a shift at a local gas station. The disappearance happened in the spring of 2013. No direct evidence linking this defendant to that young woman's disappearance, and her body has never been found. Her DNA is not on any of the defendant's belongings, but her name is in a folder on the victim's computer that is labeled as a victim's folder. Another young woman whose name appears in that folder is Rebecca Bletch. Her DNA was on some of the defendant's items. Her body was found. There, this same defendant was tried, and that case ended in a conviction. Bobby Chacon is a retired FBI agent. He's currently an attorney. He's on the line with us here on Law and Crime. Bobby, look, it seems like the tactic here under Rule 404 of the evidence, for those of you following along and who like to read those things, this is a type of character evidence. It's other acts evidence. Look, he's got a victim's folder. The first victim's name is there. Pictures of her are there. Her body was found. Her DNA was on the defendant's items. So here, maybe the defendant just did a better job cleaning up, and that's why we don't have the direct DNA link. But the computer folder suggests a common scheme or plan. This is his modus operandi. This is how he committed his crimes. This is why, members of the jury, you need to lock this guy up. That's what the prosecution will argue here, correct?
Absolutely, and that's why the pretrial hearings and the motions to either include prior bad act evidence, which sometimes is allowed and sometimes is not, was so important in this case. The prosecution won some major victories before the trial happened in hearings that are going to allow them to introduce prior bad acts of this defendant unrelated to the charged crime that could shed some light on the fact on whether or not this is a pattern of a behavior, like you said. So some major victories. Now, the judge did walk a fine line in some of those decisions pre-trial, and he allowed some evidence in and some evidence out, because we want to always make sure we're trying a defendant on a single crime with the evidence of that crime. And we don't want to convict someone on a particular crime because of something they did in the past. So there are particular rules that judges follow on whether or not to admit prior bad act evidence. In this case, there's a pattern of behavior that's so similar to past acts, so similar to some that seem to match this crime, that the judge is allowing a lot of this prior bad act evidence in, and the jury's going to kind of be able to draw that conclusion that if he did that, he probably did this. Now, there are some things that they found in the search warrant of his house that match some of the videos that he was watching. In other words, he's watching videos of murders being carried out, and then there are physical things that they either found in his house or his van that match items that were used in those videos. So he could be mimicking, the argument would be he's mimicking some of these videos he's watched, and he's gone out and purchased those items to carry out the crime, you know, in a similar way that the video shows it run by somebody else.
Yeah, I understand that, Bobby, but one of the issues in this case is the question of how far you stretch that evidence rule to allow all of this to come in. Because, look, you've got one victim who was attacked and basically left for dead on the side of the road, okay? That's one way of doing this. Now, this particular victim, Jessica Herringa, whose trial we're in the midst of right now, this is different. She was at work when this all happened. And look, I understand the rationale for the ruling is that you've got a victims folder and both of their names are in it. It suggests some kind of a motive when you tie in all these other perverse videos on the defendant's computer. So that stuff is similar, but the way that the disappearances, the attacks played out is very different factually in both cases. So it seems to me that there's potential ground to attack this decision on appeal. In other words, the decision to let all of this in.
Absolutely, I totally agree. I mean, these are always subject to appellate review, I think. But even this case, even more so, because this is a broader allowance of prior bad act than I've seen in a lot of cases.
Exactly.
It's much more narrow. And I agree with you that not only the murder that he's been convicted of, but even the attempted kidnapping, all three of these incidents have, I think, significant differences in how they were attempted to be carried out. Profilers will tell you, profilers that I work with will tell you, it's all about victimology. When someone's into this kind of thing, a serial criminal normally carries out their crimes in very similar ways. They sometimes adjust them, they learn, sometimes they modify them, but you know, you don't usually see the differences in these three that you would in a serial criminal. And I agree that there is some significant, you know, pulling up along somebody on a very rural road, a very unpopulated area, dark area at night, is much different than walking into a fully lit, open convenience store and trying to abduct somebody out of it. Those are two completely different types of abductions. And that's what you have in this case, but that evidence is going to be allowed in.
Exactly. Well, we're going to continue listening to one last piece of the testimony of the computer forensic expert. This is Gerald McCarthy. Again, the critical evidence here. The defendant, Jeffrey Willis, had a computer file labeled victims. It was abbreviated, but the bottom line is that's what it was. And there were the names of two women who turned up dead in his community. The trial that we're in the midst of right now is the Jessica Herringa case. You're listening to Real Court Cases on the Law and Crime Network and on Law and Crime on Sirius XM. You're listening to real testimony in a real murder trial here on the Law and Crime Network and on Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. That witness was a computer forensic expert, Gerald McCarthy. He was testifying in the Jeffrey Willis murder case out of Michigan. Willis is facing his second murder trial for the presumed death of Jessica Herringa. a 25-year-old mother who disappeared in the middle of her shift at a local gas station in West Michigan in the spring of 2013. The victim, Jessica Herringer's body, was never found, but prosecutors allege she was killed by this particular defendant, Jeffrey Willis. He also was convicted last year of murdering another mother named Rebecca Bletch, and files on his computer relate to the names of both victims. Bobby Chacon is an attorney who's a former FBI agent. He's here with us on Law and Crime today to help us break this case down. One issue here, Bobby, that I wish we had that we don't have is surveillance video from the gas station. And it turns out, strangely enough, that this particular gas station didn't have any surveillance cameras, which seems very, very strange to me. As a former FBI agent who's used to dealing with facts, does that just strike you as the most bizarre circumstance you've ever seen, and you're already nodding your head yes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just, like you said, it's mind-boggling. I mean, the three places we always, and I mean always, see cameras are a liquor store, a jewelry store, and a convenience store. Those three business types, I mean, it's unheard of that you can walk into one of those three types of businesses and not have security cameras. This is the first instance that I know in many, many years that a convenience store, one of those three businesses I mentioned, would not have surveillance cameras. Now, sometimes they're not working. Sometimes they're not pointed at the right place. We have those kind of situations, but rarely, and in my memory, never have I walked into one of those kinds of establishments and not had video surveillance.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the one missing piece of this, that if we had that, it would narrow this down so much. We've got a witness who saw a van similar to the van of the defendant pulling away through a back service road from this gas station. And, you know, again, that's a little nugget here that makes it more likely that this defendant is the right guy, the guy that authorities are after, and rightfully so. But, you know, you just wish you had that surveillance footage. The victim's mother, to this day, doesn't believe that her daughter is gone, but has launched an effort to try to get surveillance cameras required in those gas stations as a matter of law. We're going to be back with more analysis of the Jeffrey Willis trial here on Law and Crime in just a moment. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Aaron Keller. You're listening to our coverage of real-life court cases with harsh cross-examinations and all the concomitant drama on the Law and Crime Network. And thanks if you're listening to us on Sirius XM Radio today. We're going to continue our review of the Jeffrey Willis murder case out of Michigan in just a minute, because we are following another case here on Law and Crime, and that is a case out of Wisconsin with an alleged hatchet attack. Attorneys are in the process of seating a jury in that case, and we are expecting opening statements in that case to begin very shortly. Let's listen to some of the details. We are expecting things to pick up in that case in a few hours, and it'll be an interesting one. You just heard the details. One of the defendant, I should say the defendant, not one of the defendant, but the defendant, saying that this whole thing started in an argument over an alarm clock not being properly set. Of course, it's possible we're going to hear testimony that drugs may have fueled that argument, but a savage attack in Wisconsin being alleged, the defendant confessing to parts of it in a police interview, yet moving forward with trial. So we'll be covering that case here on Law and Crime. Back to the Jeffrey Willis case in Michigan, though. Bobby Chacon is on the line. He's a retired FBI agent who's a current attorney. So, Bobby, you've been on both sides of these cases. You deal with the facts, you deal with the law. In this case, a lot of evidence slowly piling up, but no really clear link tying the defendant directly to this young 25-year-old mother's disappearance. Jessica Herringer is the victim in this case. Her mother refuses to believe that she's dead. Difficult situation for family members. Family members pushing for a bill in the state legislature in Michigan starting a couple of years ago to require surveillance cameras at gas stations. Because, look, the accusation here is that she was somehow taken away from the gas station where she worked, and it's just a bizarre thing because just about every gas station I've ever been into, Bobby, has a surveillance camera, at least one. And look, surveillance cameras are not expensive things. It's not 1985 where you got to get this big system that's grainy and you can barely see anything. You get these little tiny devices that are the size of a coat button, and they'll record high-definition video now. So look, you've got a victim's family who refuses to believe that she's dead, but is also pushing for mandatory cameras at these gas stations if they're open late nights like this one was.
That's right. And like we said earlier, it's mind-boggling that they don't have that kind of thing. In fact, many of these establishments have them not only for potential crimes that may occur from customers coming in, but also to keep an eye on their own employees for, for things like employee theft and things like that. So, and that's been a suspicion in this case. We had a coworker on the stand last week that, in interviews with the police said she thought that this clerk may have been stealing product from the store. And so it really, on many levels, it's really puzzling that there were no cameras. However, some evidence that came in that this defendant may have been in that establishment on a number of times. And if he was casing the location, which means that he was looking to commit a crime there and was looking for things like a video camera system, he may have noticed that there were no cameras in there. And that's why he may have decided to actually do it in the store where normally, you wouldn't, because you would think, and I think now the assumption is that there are cameras. So this defendant, if he had been in that store a number of times and he was intending to carry out this crime, may have actually, in fact, noticed and took note of the fact that there was no video. And that may have contributed to his, his ability or his intent to actually carry it out in the store.
Look, prosecutors are chipping away at this defendant bit by bit. We know that there's no clear evidence, at least that's been presented yet, linking him to the crime. No smoking gun, so to speak, even though they do have a weapon that they have shown in this case. He did have a weapon, but look, no DNA, no body. We've got a computer file, and we also have another interesting conversation here. Is this the whole case? No. Is it a nugget that prosecutors can use? Absolutely. There is a bizarre conversation between this defendant, Jeffrey Willis, and a coworker, because the disappearance of this young woman, 25-year-old Jessica Herringa, at a local gas station was the talk of the town. Everybody was talking about it. People were looking for this young woman. There was a bizarre conversation between the defendant and a coworker right after the disappearance. The defendant's reaction is the critical part here, folks, so let's listen to the coworker on the witness stand. You're listening to Law and Crime coverage on the Law and Crime Network and on Sirius XM Radio of the Jeffrey Willis murder trial out of Michigan. The topic for discussion is how the defendant reacted when a coworker cracked a joke about the disappearance of this 25-year-old presumed victim, Jessica Herringa. And the bottom line is that the defendant, Jeffrey Willis, completely flipped out over what was intended, apparently, to be an innocuous comment. The coworkers see the defendant walk in. They had no clue that he might have been involved in the case and saw him with a bunch of scratches. You just heard the line there that Jeffrey Willis looked like he'd gotten into a cat fight. And people are saying, oh, maybe he's the one that attacked that woman that's all over the news that people are looking for, and he flips out. Bobby Chacon, former FBI agent, if you were in an interrogation and you heard a response like that, what would go through your mind?
Well, there's a fine line between being defensive about something and then being overly defensive about it, right? And it sounds like this witness is trying to imply that he was overly defensive about it. In fact, he had kidded other people about the same issue, and they didn't have that reaction. However, the defense can explain that away. Some people are more sensitive to it. Some people are just have different dispositions the way they react to it. If I was in an interrogation room and he did that to me, I would definitely use that whenever an interrogation subject breaks down emotionally to the point where they're upset like that. It's an opportunity for somebody like me to get in there and get more information and lead them in different ways to where I can get to the truth. And so, because normally they have walls up, but when you break out like that in an emotional outburst, the walls come down a little bit and we can get a peek behind the wall and maybe some truth. It astounds me that if he did do this with fresh wounds, he would still go back to the site of the abduction. You would think that he would stay away until those wounds healed a little bit and they weren't as noticeable. But this witness said, it was fairly clear that he had pretty good cut, especially the one on his face. So it clearly looks like, wounds that, someone would have reached out if they were trying to be abducted. So, it really, why he would go back to that scene and be seen by those people with those wounds before they had a chance to heal, is really, it's quite, puzzling.
Yeah, it's another nugget here that the state's going to use, and use it the state did. And his excuse that he got the wounds from a brake job, you heard the witness say, hey, look, I've changed brakes. It doesn't cause scratches all over your face. I don't know about you, Bobby, but I indeed, speaking for myself, Aaron Keller, Law and Crime host, I have indeed done brake jobs on cars. I've busted my knuckles up in the process, but I don't get scratches all over my face, scratches that are so deep I need to start wrapping wounds up with all kinds of gauze and everything. And that's what the defendant did here in this case. That doesn't sound like a brake job kind of a wound.
No, that's the problem when someone is going to lie and they make up a difficult, if they're confronted on the scene. He might not have expected to be questioned about those, and he had a bad lie lined up. I mean, you could say a number of things in a rural area. I mean, I would say my dog jumped on me. I have two big dogs. They jumped up on me, scratched my face. That actually does happen sometimes. And so you want to come up with, a lie that's going to be at least somewhat plausible with your lifestyle and the area where you are. And I think he may have just fumbled it. And there's another attempt by the prosecution to put Willis closer to the crime scene, put him closer to the potential victim in this case. They're inching their way towards putting him right there when it happened in a violent confrontation. But it's all these little, like you said, nuggets of, information from different witnesses. And, this all does still leave the defense a lot of room, to kind of build a reasonable, doubt defense. I mean, none of this is a smoking gun. The van that was similar, that was seen by, a witness, I would have a private investigator find out how many vans of a similar type are registered in that county or in that general vicinity. There may be 1,000. So, there's all these things that are going to give the defense, somewhat of a chance to build in a reasonable doubt defense in, and all you need is one of the jurors.
Exactly. Okay, let's listen to a little bit more from that coworker. He wraps up the story. Again, we're listening to testimony related to the Jeffrey Willis murder case in Michigan. He's accused of attacking a 25-year-old gas station attendant named Jessica Herringa while she was at work. Let's listen again to the coworker. That's testimony from a real court case, the Jeffrey Willis murder trial in West Michigan. A coworker of the defendant named Clifford Barron on the witness stand talking about Jeffrey Willis, the defendant, showing up at work with injuries. They joked, hey, did you have anything to do with that disappearance of that gas station worker that we're hearing so much about? And the defendant completely flips out about it. The reaction might be evidence that he was tied to the case, but we've got some other big testimony to talk about today. Dawn Schmidt is tied into this case and another case that this defendant is accused of being a party to. This defendant accused in 3 big cases in West Michigan. One is the murder of Jessica Herringa that we're talking about now. Another is the murder of Rebecca Bletch, another young woman who was attacked while jogging. He was already convicted in that case. And yet another case, a third case, involves a teenager, then teenager, named Madison Nygaard. She was attacked while she was walking home and escaped. She ran to a stranger's house in the neighborhood, absolutely terrified. She gave some critical testimony in this case, critical testimony in the previous case, the Rebecca Bletch case, and the neighbor whose house she went to testified in both cases. Bobby, again, a lot of very bad acts tied into this particular defendant. Is it enough to say that he definitively, beyond a reasonable doubt, had anything to do with the disappearance of gas station attendant Jessica Herringa?
Well, I think that's clearly the question that is going to go to the jury. It's going to be very interesting on closing arguments on, how the defense hammers away at that, because this is clearly a case, I think, that the prosecution has staked its success on whether or not the jurors believe that because he committed these prior acts, he committed this act, because the direct physical evidence, I mean, if you prohibited all of that prior bad act evidence and you're just looking at the physical evidence presented in this case, I think there's more than enough reasonable doubt for an acquittal. So I think that, the prosecution has a huge stake in making this bad act, these prior bad acts, stick to the defendant as if that he did this one because of those prior bad acts. So I think that's going to be a crucial question for the jury. I don't know that they have enough physical and direct evidence, even circumstantial evidence in this case alone, for a conviction, but it's really going to depend on whether the jurors kind of look at that prior bad act as a continuing scheme and pattern of behavior by this defendant. And that's really what it's going to turn on.
Exactly. Okay, this is really important testimony as well. This is from Dawn Schmidt. She was the neighbor who just happened to be swept up in this case because Jeffrey Willis, the defendant who's on trial here, just happened, allegedly, to attack a teenager who was walking home near this witness's house. And this witness provided safe shelter for that teenager right after she was allegedly pulled into, or attempted to have been pulled into, this defendant's van at gunpoint and managed to escape. So let's listen again. This is Dawn Schmidt's testimony in the Jeffrey Willis murder trial. That was testimony in the Jeffrey Willis murder case out of West Michigan from Dawn Schmidt. She just happened to be drawn into this case and in the previous case that this defendant faced because the defendant allegedly tried to abduct a teenager at gunpoint and draw her into his van in that witness's neighborhood. Bobby Chacon is a former FBI agent and current attorney. He's joining us now for analysis. Bobby, there's an emotional side to this case and there's a logical side to this case. This woman witnessed absolute terror from that teenager who was cowering in fear in her house because the teenager said she had been almost abducted at gunpoint by that defendant, Jeffrey Willis. I can't imagine a more terrifying situation for that witness to have been swept up into.
That's right. And I think this is emotional testimony that the prosecution wants the jury to hear. They want the jury to look at Willis and say, this is a bad guy. Look what he did over here. Look what he did. So the fact that we're asking you to believe that he did this over here is more believable, because look over here, because in reality, this prior crime and this testimony has nothing to do with the current case, right? So
exactly.
What they're trying to do is use it to kind of put in the jury's mind, and that's why the emotional aspect of it is more important. They're trying to put in the mind, if you see the defendant sitting over there, he's a bad guy, and he's capable of doing this to people. And so that's one more step that the prosecution takes for the jury to believe, yeah, that's a bad guy. It's not inconceivable that he then did this particular current crime.
Exactly. And there's a logical side to the case as well, which you started to hit on, and that is the legal side. The burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt in American criminal trials, and the state needs to prove that this defendant committed this crime against this victim as charged. Because he tried to abduct, kidnap, whatever, this teenager on the side of a road, does that necessarily mean that he's the one who took 25-year-old Jessica Herringa away from her workplace one evening in the spring of 2013? Does one necessarily mean the other? And that's the logical question that jurors are going to have to decide here.
That's right. And I think that was why it was a huge victory by the prosecution in the pretrial hearings to get this actually before the jury, this evidence, which normally, most of the time has not come in, prior bad acts do not come in. So I think that, without those prior bad acts, I think that the prosecution would have a much tougher time building a reasonable doubt case against Willis in this particular case, with the lack of physical evidence, the lack of direct evidence. No one has really put him at the scene of the crime on the evening of the crime. And so that's a real high burden for the prosecution to get over. And they're trying to get over that by introducing this prior bad act that the defense cannot relitigate. You can't relitigate those cases now in this particular trial. That was litigated at pretrial hearings when they argued on whether or not this evidence should come in before the jury. So now the defense is kind of put on its heels. You will see a lot of this either, in the defense direct case or certainly on closing arguments, where the defense is going to say, just because he did this does not mean he did that. And the prosecution's burden is to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that he did this particular crime with showing you physical evidence of this particular crime. I'm sure the defense is going to have to take some kind of tact in that direction.
Exactly. We are listening to testimony in the Jeffrey Willis murder case out of Michigan. A defendant who is accused of a number of sick, perverse acts is on trial for the murder of a 25-year-old gasoline station attendant named Jessica Herringa. Her body has never been found. Her mother refuses to believe she's dead. Did this defendant indeed kill her? And why does the state's theory of the case not result in the discovery of a body? There are a lot of what-ifs in this case. No direct evidence, no DNA, but a lot of other bad stuff. We're going to continue analyzing the case when we come back. You're listening to the Law and Crime Network, and thanks again for those of you joining us on Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. Back, everyone. You're listening to coverage of the Jeffrey Willis murder trial on Law and Crime, and thanks for those of you joining us on Sirius XM Radio. I'm Aaron Keller. I'll be helping walk you through the testimony this morning. Let's go back in time to one of the other cases that this defendant is accused of perpetrating, and that is the attempted abduction of a teenager named Madison Nygaard. We just heard from Dawn Schmidt, who was a neighbor who sheltered Madison Nygaard after the alleged attack. Now let's listen to a 911 call that was placed by that teenager. She was in absolute terror. Let's listen. This is sheer terror that's coming over that 911 call. I'm here with Bobby Chacon, retired FBI agent, current attorney. You were listening to a 911 call from a teenager named Madison Nygaard, who said that she was almost abducted at gunpoint by Jeffrey Willis, the defendant in this case. Dawn Schmidt, a neighbor who just happened to live where this attack was alleged to have occurred, sheltered that teenager, called 911. She was on the call with the teenager. Look, we've heard a lot of 911 calls in our time, but you can hear terror in the voices there. This is not a made-up situation. This is real.
You know, the defense in the pretrial motions probably saying this is why this has to be kept out. This is inflammatory, it's emotional, and it does not have to do with the case in chief, the current case on trial. So, Your Honor, this is just simply inflammatory. It's going to inflame the emotions of the jury. It doesn't have to do anything to do with this particular crime that he's charged with. You know, so I think that that's the argument that they probably made pre-trial, and we're seeing that inflammation, that emotional response. Probably the jury is probably having the same emotional response that you and I are having to this thing of the sheer terror. Not only sheer terror, but the prosecution wants you to know and wants that jury to feel that sheer terror was caused by that defendant sitting right over there. And that's the point of this testimony. It's not, you know, that guy sitting over there, that defendant is what caused this terror in this young woman's voice. We don't have Ms. Herringa's voice to hear, but we are going to apply, you know, simply presume that there was similar fear and terror put into her when she was abducted out of that convenience store. And that's going to be the prosecution's theory in their argument.
Yes, so I agree with you completely, Bobby. Let's continue listening to that 911 call. Again, we're discussing the Jessica Herringa murder trial in Michigan. She was 25 years old when she disappeared from a gas station. The defendant, Jeffrey Willis, is accused of killing her and also of attempting to abduct this teenager who was on this 911 call. More of those horrific 911 calls from West Michigan where the teenager, Madison Nygaard, is in the house of a neighbor, Dawn Schmidt, telling 911 dispatchers that this defendant, Jeffrey Willis, tried to abduct her, pull her into a van at gunpoint. She got away. She ran to the nearest house that she could. She had no clue who lived there. The neighbor gave her shelter. The neighbor protected her. Jeffrey Willis disappeared off into wherever. And this is the key to this whole situation, though, because it was that attempted abduction which led police to start looking at businesses and homes in the area who had surveillance cameras, and they saw the van drive by, and they started looking at motor vehicle registries to figure out who in the area had that kind of van. They even had motor vehicle experts looking at the footage that they finally were able to track down of that van and say, this is a specific make, a specific model. Here are some VIN numbers. Then they found it in the motor vehicle database. They started closing in on this defendant, and that's how they caught him. And now he's charged with at least 3 crimes. The Rebecca Bletch murder, which resulted in a conviction last year, the attempted abduction of that teenager who was on that 911 call, and now the Jessica Herringa murder. 25-year-old Jessica Herringa, gas station attendant, mother of a young child. Bobby Chacon, you're an attorney, a former FBI agent. We've been dissecting these calls. The terror in the voices suggests, tells the story. I don't even want to say suggest, but look, I don't think anybody's making this up. You know, I think that they're getting this into evidence not only for the emotional reaction, which we're feeling as well, but also to say, hey, look, this is real. This is what it was like. This is what it was like in the moment when someone was at the grip of this particular defendant, and that's the point they're trying to make here.
Sure, absolutely, and it does match up with other evidence in this case. So what you hear here is a young woman literally fighting for her life. Mm-hmm. She's literally fighting for her life. She's getting away. If she doesn't fight and get away from this guy, she's probably going to end up dead. And by doing so and by getting away, she probably saved the lives of other women. Now, you put that in the jury's mind, along with the fact that you had a witness say the defendant had wounds on him shortly after the Ms. Herringa's incident. You marry that with a drop of blood out back where the van was seen, out back of the convenience store, which Ms. Herringa's blood was found. Now that can be, you can try to explain that away, saying she worked there, she may have just had one drop of blood, but she was cleaning up and cut herself. But when you marry all of these incidents together, you know that this defendant is a man who is used to having physical confrontations with women in which both of them sustain injuries, obviously. And so this is marrying a prior event to the physical evidence in this case. Now, so when they see the witness say that he had these wounds on him, and then they see Ms. Herringa's blood out back where the van was seen, all of these tell the story. They each fill in a little piece of the story, and this is just part of that, is saying that, you can see maybe in the juror's mind saying, this incident that you're hearing so emotionally from this victim probably was replayed in that convenience store or just out back of that convenience store with Ms. Herringa. This is this defendant's MO. He physically overpowers women and he gets them into his van. And so that's part of the narrative that the prosecution wants to put in the jury's mind.
Yes, let's continue with our review of testimony here. Madison Nygaard, that teenager who says she was almost pulled into the defendant's van at gunpoint. She fought for her life. She got away. She went to a neighbor's house. She is next on the witness stand in the Rebecca Bletch murder case out of Michigan. Defendant we're in the Jessica Herringa case. I'm sorry, I said Rebecca Bletch. That was the previous victim for whom the defendant was tried. This time he's on trial in the Jessica Herringa case, 25 years old. She was a gas station attendant. That was testimony from the teenager who says that she was abducted at gunpoint by the defendant, Jeffrey Willis. She got away. She ran to a neighbor's house, called 911. She survived. She was on the witness stand in this case. This is the Jessica Herringa case, the murder trial of Jeffrey Willis on accusations that he killed a 25-year-old gas station attendant who herself was a young mother. Her body has never been found. The evidence tying Jeffrey Willis to Jessica Herringa's death is circumstantial. The threads are not terribly strong, and the state is trying to connect the dots with a lot of other acts, such as the attempted abduction of that teenager who we were listening to. We're going to have more of her testimony when we come back. We're going to take a quick break. More here on Law and Crime in a moment.
I'm Law and Crime's Heather Hansen. I've been defending medical malpractice cases for over 20 years and have been named one of the top 50 trial attorneys in Pennsylvania. I'm also a trained mediator and a communications consultant working with people to become better advocates for themselves. I love being a host at Law and Crime because I love interacting with the audiences and finding out what they think is important in the cases. Not only is it interesting, it helps me in my own work with juries.
Okay, Joseph Santoro, I work for the warrant squad, and you are now under arrest. We know there's warrants out on you. No, I'm kidding. Don't worry, Joe. You got at least 10 minutes before the cops come.
I need a cavity search.
Well, not by me. Maybe the cameraman. You know what? This is totally BS. Literally, with Bill Stanton saying, have a great and safe day.
Bullshit.
Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, and thanks for those of you joining us directly on the Law and Crime Network. I'm Aaron Keller. I'm here with Bobby Chacon, former FBI agent, current attorney. We're talking about the Jeffrey Willis murder case out of West Michigan, a man accused of a number of crimes, 2 murders, 1 attempted abduction. We're talking today about the Jessica Herringa disappearance. She was never seen again after April 26, 2013, and we're listening to testimony of someone else he's accused of trying to harm, and that's a teenager who was walking by the side of the road. So, Bobby, this is a case where the state is pretty much trying to throw everything in with hopes that the jury looks and says, okay, if he's going to take this young woman, maybe he also took Jessica Herringa. It's part of this guy's scheme of operation, and it's a tough evidence call for a judge to decide whether to let that in or keep it out of a case. Here, the judge let it all in.
That's right, and it's the specific rules about why you would let it in that it shows a significant pattern of behavior and so similar to the current crime that it's allowed in. Now, what you'll see eventually is the prosecution argue just that these are so similar, and you heard the testimony of the young woman, you heard the testimony of the neighbor whose house she ran into, and you saw that he tried to overpower her and get her into a van, and that's the same thing that happened to Ms. Herringer, in our opinion, in our narrative. And so that's what the prosecution is going to argue. The defense is then going to argue that these are different. They're probably going to argue some of the same things they argued at the hearing, that there's differences, that, you know, along the side of a road while you're just cruising along in a rural neighborhood, you know, is different than walking into a very lit, open convenience store where other people may be. And so those are differences in the crimes. So you shouldn't assume, Mr. and Mrs. Jura, that they are similar or that he did this because he did the prior crime. So those are going to be arguments that both sides make. The prosecution obviously is going to argue that they're so similar that you can assume that this pattern of behavior continued. The defense is going to argue, you know, no, wait. There are significant differences that distinguish this prior bad act to what he's being alleged to have done in this particular case.
Yes, exactly. Well, we're going to listen to a little bit more of that teenager's testimony. Her name, Madison Nygaard. She says she was attacked by this defendant, Jeffrey Willis. That defendant now on trial for the presumed murder of 25-year-old Jessica Herringa, whose body has never been found and whose mother has never given up hope that her daughter might somewhere still be alive. I'm going to sign off. It's been great to be with you this morning. Bobby, great to be on with you as well. We're going to listen to more of this testimony when we come back with analysis. My colleague Heather Hansen will be here.